Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this The Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. If you want to keep up with all things Clown Decade, please do of course subscribe to the channel and become a channel member. Right, luckily it's a day in the Clown Decade where I actually have some good news for you. Panorama's Trump edit was final straw for Tim Davie at the BBC. The Director General weathered a series of scandals during his leadership, but the pressure eventually told. And he has resigned as Director General, and the BBC News CEO Deborah Turness is leaving as well. Because as I went through in a video last week, you obviously cannot take two parts from an hour apart, splice them together, and allow the viewership to think that effectively Donald Trump was saying storm the Capitol when he said nothing of the sort. And so it's very good to see heads rolling here. So in the end it was a crisis too far. After weathering a series of scandals during his 5 years at the top, on Sunday night Tim Davie concluded he had had enough. The BBC Director General 58 ended his 2 decades at the corporation and resigned over allegations of bias at Britain's national broadcaster. He is said by friends to have been left furious by a dossier of allegations compiled by former advisor and leaked last week to the Daily Telegraph that precipitated his departure. Chief among its litany of accusations was the revelation that Panorama had misled viewers last year over a speech given by Trump before the Capitol riots in 2021, but it also highlighted failures in the broadcaster's coverage of Gaza and trans issues, because there was a woman the other day who, on her autocue on BBC News, it said pregnant people. She gave a huff and said women, because only women can get pregnant. And the BBC upheld complaints that people had about her not saying pregnant people, because people like that still actually exist. But there's the BBC being unable to call Hamas terrorists, despite the fact that Hamas are prescribed by the British government as terrorists, so it's not even inaccurate. There's just general poor reporting about anything remotely right-wing, and I think that we need to bear in mind that Tim Davie was put in 5 years ago at the behest of Boris Johnson. You know, this was in 2020 when Dominic was still there. The whole idea of Tim Davie being there was to get rid of this bias, or at least deal with it to some degree, and he's made it worse, so it's no wonder that he's left, because he did the opposite of what he was supposed to do. He somehow allowed it to get worse. Insiders have said that this was the straw that broke the camel's back after a series of controversies, and in his resignation note, Davie highlighted the personal impact that working in such a febrile, polarised times had on him. Well, perhaps you shouldn't have allowed the BBC to be so polarising then. That was the way to answer this. Stop allowing the BBC to be such a leftist diatribe, actually have some impartial reporting, and people wouldn't hate it. You couldn't do that, though. You allowed Panorama to be absolutely horrendous and lie to the British people. Of course people got fed up. He's faced 5 years of intense scrutiny on him and the organisation, and to be at the level of public life takes its toll. I can understand that, but at the end of the day, he's just made the problems worse. Tim's decision is not only about the events of the past week, but years of build-up. Davie is understood to have returned to work revitalised after a summer break and a brief hiatus from scandals, but his bubble was burst by the leaked documents. It didn't take that much to bring it all back, they added. A weight was lifted after he made the decision to go. Ally said that the increasingly hostile tone of public discourse was encapsulated by a post on X by White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, mocking Davie's fall. And this was an excellent tweet, by the way. Leavitt posted a headline of a news story, Trump goes to war with fake news BBC, under the word shot, next to the breaking news of his departure under the word chaser. Because ultimately, yeah, this is just another victory for Trump. Because once again his enemies just line up the skittles for him to throw the bowling ball at. For Americans watching this, skittles are just another name for bowling pins. They're technically a slightly different thing, but just making sure you know that I'm not talking about the candies. Caroline also came out with another banger on Twitter, or X as we all have to call it now, saying BBC News is dying because they are anti-Trump fake news and everyone should instead watch GB News, which is going to be a... I mean, that's a headshot, that's a fatal wound for the BBC if I've ever seen one, because GB News is already outperforming BBC News, and the BBC The BBC is likely to report that this tweet has happened. This is also with Donald Trump's statement from Truth Social, where he said the top people in the BBC, including Tim Davie, the boss, are quitting/fired because they were caught doctoring my very good, perfect speech of January 6. Thank you to The Telegraph for exposing these corrupt journalists, and yes, well done to The Telegraph for effectively reporting on a dossier that was leaked to them, but, still, it's ended up with some good from our side of the political spectrum, so I'm not gonna be too cynical about that. They are very dishonest people who tried to step on the scales of the presidential election. That's true. On top of everything else, they are from a foreign country, one that many consider our number one ally. What a terrible thing for democracy. Now, taking away all the embellishing that Trump does from this, yes, I do largely agree with what he has to say. The BBC should obviously not be reporting and making documentaries about anything, let alone either in Britain or America, that misleads viewers. That's the problem, because as we will go through, there's a lot of journalists saying, actually, editing speeches down is perfectly normal and happens all the time. And a load of journalists who are actually worth their salt were replying, yeah, but you're supposed to do it in a way that actually summarises what was said, rather than doctors a speech to make Trump say something that he didn't actually say, such as go to the Capitol and fight, which he never ever said. I think the worst part is that the cut's really, really obvious, but nobody in their right mind would think that it was a 54-minute gap between that cut. That is absurd. Anyway, back to the article. Some other staff were removed by his decision, pointing to the £500,000 he was paid last year. The battering of the Beeb feels unrelenting and no one is sure how much more they can take, a producer said. But it is the biggest job in media and he is paid to put up with it. I mean, fair enough. The board was understood to have been left shocked by Davie's decision when they were informed on Sunday afternoon, but the writing had perhaps been on the wall for some time. How shocked were these board members that Panorama decided to completely doctor a President Trump speech to make him say something he never said? We're talking Simpsons levels of doctoring, by the way, with the whole Homer being a pervert thing. At recent events, Davie had started to quip, "You should see my inbox," when asked about the difficulty of running the BBC. His jocular tone masked a genuine build-up of pressure, and in an interview with the BBC in July, after the decision to drop MasterChef presenter Greg Wallace and John Torode over allegations of inappropriate behaviour, Davie admitted he had been having a very, very tough time. Well, he's gone now, and I don't really blame him, because I think running the BBC is very difficult, because you do anything to actually deal with the bias, everyone goes nuts, as we're about to go into, and if you don't do anything, the bias makes every problem everyone's complaining about worse, apart from radical lefties. So if you're very good at just ignoring what the public say about you, take the £500,000 a year. Davie couldn't hack it after 5 years, though, so there we go. At least he made £2.5 million out of it. Well, most of that went on taxes, to be fair, so I hope that he's happy with most of that money going to the government to be wasted. Anyway, the BBC Today programme today finished off with a bit of a discussion about what's the BBC to do. And well, I mean, the guests they have on, I think you can understand that they leave the elephant of left-wing bias in the BBC silent in the room.
To reflect on all of that, Alan Rusbridger, the former editor of The Guardian, now editor of Prospect magazine, and Simon Lewis is here, former director of communications for Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen, for Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, and now co-host of When It Hits the Fan here on Radio 4. Morning to you both.
So this panel is a BBC radio presenter who's obviously introducing everyone, a ex-editor, I should say, of The Guardian, which, as I have gone through in a previous video, there is a revolving door between the BBC and The Guardian, and half of Guardian print media go to the BBC, so anyone who's largely involved in The Guardian will not criticise the BBC because they need the BBC to buy their papers to keep them in business. And you have a comms director for the royal family who now hosts a programme on the BBC to talk about the BBC. What I'm trying to say here is that you've got three people who have absolutely no interest whatsoever in seriously dealing with the problems with the BBC, because if they keep saying bad things about it, well, let's face it, their jobs will be under risk. And so, as I say, it just leads to a very big elephant in the room being left unmentioned.
Is it an undoable job, Director General of the BBC?
Well, there are some jobs in British public life which I think are undoable. Archbishop of Canterbury, manager of the men's football team, Home Secretary and Director General of the BBC. Why have 3 of the last 5 Director Generals had to resign? By the way, I think Tim Davie's done an excellent job. And the reason is because, first of all, the job is too big and there probably needs to be a separation of responsibilities. But secondly, the pressure that you are under as a Director General, any of these public roles, becomes more and more intense, irrespective of what kind of challenges there are.
I mean, do you see what I mean? Tim Davie has not dealt with the core issues people have with the BBC. There's still a large amount of bias. The Panorama edit was absolutely dreadful. It's not even been mentioned here. Oh, Tim Davies did a good job, though, because, there's a lot of pressure there. The job's too big. Of course the job's big. He gets £500,000 a year. Sorry, I do not have sympathy for him. He was put in for a very specific reason. People don't like the BBC because, remember Brexit? Yeah, everyone was against us. Oh, and when we got into number 10, Boris Johnson won. Again, that was despite the BBC having an awful lot of anti-Johnson bias. Please, can you get the BBC to actually report things properly? Did he? No. It got worse under him. The Hamas war reporting from the BBC was horrendous. There's a reason GB News now is seen by more people every day than BBC News and Sky News, because they are actually capable of being impartial when reporting the news. And when they have panels, they actually have left-wingers and actually have right-wingers on. Even the audiences, which obviously are largely centre-right leaning, even they are more impartial than BBC's Question Time audience. Has anything been done about that to stop the activisms filling up the seats for that? No, of course there hasn't. This is why it's dying a death, and nobody on this panel can actually face up to that, because if they do, they risk their jobs. Simple as that.
Frankly, 5 years in a job like this, to me, is pretty good going. But I think we've all got to ask ourselves how we make these jobs more doable.
I mean, the answer's pretty obvious. Stop allowing the BBC to be infested with, frankly, people that want to lie to the British public. There is a simple way to deal with this. Just do things that the public are complaining about. Deal with those problems. The problem actually that Tim Davie has is that, and any Director General has, is that if they do try and deal with that, you get a lot of internal friction and people saying, no, don't do that, the BBC's great the way it is. There's this really weird bias. It's a lot like the NHS, really, where the BBC can do no wrong. Oh, don't you know what principles it was put up for? Educate, entertain, and inform. It's the gold standard of journalism, don't you know? The BBC used to be very good with its journalism. It got really bad in the 2010s, and even before that, there was people saying it's a bit biased, but it got really, really bad post-2010, especially post-Tories getting back in after Blair, and it only got worse since. It wasn't very good during Brexit. It's been horrible since Trump got in, and Farage obviously is rising in the political world once again too. And what does this panel say? Oh, just make the job a bit easier. That's not a solution to any of the problems that keep being brought up. Again, the elephants in the room and not being mentioned.
I think it's a fantastically difficult job. He's got to be editor-in-chief of an organisation that pumps out, I think, 32,000 hours of content a year. And he's got to be on top of that and answerable to anybody who makes a mistake in any of that output.
Yes, it's a very difficult job, don't you know? There's thousands and thousands of hours of output that he's answerable to. Yeah, that's why he's paid $500,000 a year. What's he actually done to try and deal with the fact that there's scandal after scandal? Nobody can actually tell what's happened since the whole, we just let a Hamas official's son narrate a documentary that we aired. Was anything done about that? Have heads rolled for that? Has there been any difference in how the production of these things are done, the broadcasting decisions? I don't think so. But again, what can these BBC presenters and Guardian journalists say? Nothing. All they can say is, to be fair to him, it's very difficult and I understand why he's left. Can we get to the core of the issue? Again, this is all about Trump's speech being completely doctored to say something that he didn't actually say. Kind of important.
Alan, you wrote yesterday on Prospect website, the BBC has bigger impartiality problems than its coverage of Trump. You believe there is a problem on the board.
Yeah, it's a very odd board. The main board, I counted 3 out of 13 who have any experience of journalism in the 21st century. And then there's a curious small group called the Editorial Standards Group, which has 5 people. This is a bit nerdy, but bear with me. 5 people, 3 of whom are insiders. That's Samir Shah, the chairman, Tim Davie, and Deborah Turness, head of news, and 2 outsiders. And until recently, only one of those outsiders had any experience of journalism, and that was Sir Robbie Gibb, appointed by Boris Johnson, who couldn't possibly claim to be impartial. He was a spin doctor for the Conservative Party. And so I think this is where a lot of the problems have arisen, that this strange little body, which is the only body which is there to look at standards and guidelines, which I think is a complete pantomime horse.
It's just kind of nuts to me. Oh, yeah, so you say that the impartiality problem goes all the way to the top. Yeah, well, the top has a few Tories in. This is apparently the problem, according to an ex-Guardian editor. Oh, it's too right-wing, don't you know? There's a Tory spin doctor, ex-Tory spin doctor there. Yeah, that's probably why it's left-wing, by the way. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'd be incredibly annoyed if Alistair Campbell was on the board, given that he's an ex-Labour spin doctor. But ultimately, if even a Tory spin doctor cannot make the institution right, not even right-leaning, just less left-leaning, then what chance does anyone have of fixing the institution? I don't think it's impossible for what it's worth, but it is a mammoth job, and ultimately doing that job is going to just annoy everyone within the BBC. Make everyone outside it very happy, though.
Well, I completely agree with Alan. I think the governance of the BBC is a challenge. I mean, every single crisis Dave and I have looked at in the corporate world, there's always been a governance failure at its root. And one of the challenges here has been, as you've said already, why did it take a week for the governing body to agree a statement? I mean, when we looked at the Buckingham Palace issue at Andrew, one of the challenges and questions there was, why did it take so long? There were good reasons, but the problem is, given the current environment, people will not wait. So I think questions must be asked about the board and why it didn't act more quickly.
I mean, I agree with them insofar as the board is ultimately who should be answerable to the public, given that, the board is effectively in control of the BBC. But again, completely missing the point that the BBC has an institutionally leftist-leaning bias. No, that's not the problem. They just take a while for their PR spins. That's the complaint here. The complaint is that they don't deal with PR quick enough. Sorry. But the problem with the BBC is that they only seem to care about PR spins. They don't care to actually deal with the root causes of these problems, which is that literally on an institutional level, it has a leftist leaning, and it will force people to lean that way if they are in the institution long enough. That seems to have happened with Tim Davie, because at no point really has anyone said, yes, we were wrong to Dr. Trump's speech like that. There seems to be nothing even close to resembling that in a statement. Of course, at time of recording, the BBC haven't made an official statement on this, but this is what happens every time. There's barely anything about the Hamas minister's son being the narrator for a documentary on the Gaza war. Sorry, but ultimately, this is just a picture of 3 dogs in a burning room all saying, yeah, this is fine, you just need to be quicker on the PR trigger. Just crazy.
And the thing is, I watched the Panorama programme, which is quite difficult to watch now because the BBC has taken it down over the weekend. And apart from that really bad mistake, the program is fine. I mean, it does 2 things. It tries to anticipate what a Trump's presidency would be like, and in that way, it slightly underestimated what it's going to be like, what it was like. And it also does a rather good job of explaining why Trump is so popular, was so popular.
Doesn't matter how good the rest of the program is. And again, it was a really bad mistake. We can kind of admit that. Sorry, but there's a difference between a mistake and a deliberate attempt to mislead the public, which, I'm sorry, you don't make the mistake of cutting out an hour's worth of speech to try and summarise it. That's not a mistake, that is deliberate. And that's the thing, everyone can see this. There are even centre-lefties who aren't as in love with the BBC as a lot of other journalists, basically agreeing with that. And they're getting fed up of being called Trump simps just for thinking that the BBC Panorama show shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry, what could have been a perfectly adequate programme was overshadowed by a deliberate attempt to make Trump seem like a dictator who was up for violence against the Capitol building. I'm sorry that happened, but ultimately it is not a particularly forgivable action. Hence, heads are rolling. Again, it's not just Tim Davie, it's also the CEO of BBC News, because Panorama is a BBC News programme. And again, the point of the BBC is to inform and educate. You're not informing and educating if you're lying to people about what Donald Trump said, which is what happened. But my God, we're getting into defences of that soon.
Simon, you mix in circles in which there'll be people saying, well, Alan Rusbridger would say that because he's from the Guardian. He's an old lefty. Forgive me, Alan. That's what they'd say about you. And he's defending a bunch of sort of lefties at the BBC. And the truth is they get it wrong on a whole series of things. We all know they do.
Yeah, but to be fair, I only say that because I actually pay attention. Every few months there's a massive scandal at the BBC that I have to cover because they just seem incapable of not making mistakes like this that show that they have massive impartiality problems. An ex-Guardian journalist, of course, is going to defend that. You are correct, because there's a revolving door between the two institutions.
So they've sort of got a point, haven't they?
They have, but let's be honest, it's the most trusted news source in the world, and certainly in the UK, so the BBC's doing something right.
Sorry, that might have been true even as closely as 5 years ago. Even that's probably pushing it. I certainly don't think that's true in Britain. World Service, maybe. I think the BBC is probably more trusted than, say, I don't know, Iran's state media. The BBC World Service genuinely isn't actually that bad. There's even some things on Radio 4 that I quite like. I mean, to be quite honest with you, even just saying, people saying the BBC have a left-wing bias have a point, you know, that's pretty good, to be honest, from the BBC. But then, again, this entire panel here is just here to defend the BBC. And again, if you want to have an indication of what news source people trust, well, GB News is outranking BBC on that. And that's despite a whole bunch of their panel shows obviously having a centre-right leaning, which, of course, they would. But half the point of GB News was to be an alternative news source and discussion channel about current events and politics, and honestly, thank God we got GB News. I mean, you still get surveys saying, yeah, the BBC are the most trusted, blah, 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 but you've really got to understand an awful lot of that is inertia. I mean, really, how often do you hear, oh, the BBC did this good documentary? You know, the only ones I particularly like are Simon Reeves's travel documentaries these days. Beyond that, I have absolutely nothing good to say about the BBC, to be quite frank with you. And yeah, I do watch GB News a hell of a lot more than anything else when it comes to mainstream broadcasts. And even then, I go to the Times to read the news. I listen to their podcast to mainly hear what the mainstream elites are thinking. I don't really bother with the BBC because, well, they never even get anyone remotely right-wing on. At least Times Radio do. And then I listen to the Telegraph for a general centre-righty take with a bit of a bleeding heart added onto it. I actually listen to BBC Radio 4 usually on the way to the horses. PM with Evan Davies. That's not bad, to be honest with you. But is that not bad programme really worth the rest of the editorial mistakes that they constantly make? No, of course not, but you're going to get non-stop defence of this from the mainstream media elites anyway.
I do think it's a slightly hysterical period, actually, and I think the real concern is the BBC is rudderless as it goes into what is coming down the track, which is going to be one of the biggest negotiations with government for years.
Yeah, well, it's like a lot of that for an awful lot of the media elites. I've noticed this with the Times radio presenters who are very clearly centre-left, think Hugo Rifkind. It's why I find it so interesting. They don't really know what their arguments are anymore. Their entire worldview has just collapsed over the past few years. And they're out of ideas beyond saying, my God, Starmer's pretty terrible, isn't he? The government's in complete chaos, despite the fact that this is exactly what they asked for. Load of centre-righties and righties saying, yep, we have massive problems economically and culturally, here's a few basic ways to fix it. Reform keep throwing ideas that a lot of centre-righties and righties quite like actually out there, and the lefties go, well, this all seems a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? How are they going to pay for all this? Which is exactly the point, ironically, that both Reform and the Tories were making about Labour. It's amazing how quickly things change when they actually got what they wanted.
30 seconds then on the biggest question, which is there are people listening who might just say, you just don't need the BBC anymore. I mean, you know, modern technology has changed. There's a million places to get your news.
Completely true, by the way, and in fact there's plenty of other sources that are more trustworthy and less biased. I think even Murdoch-owned media is less biased than the BBC, and that's saying something.
Do you, Simon, when you look ahead, think this organisation will still exist in a form quite similar to this in 10 years' time?
Well, we've got 2 grandchildren. I'll go further than that. I think, yes, even 30 or 40 years, but it'll have to metamorphose in response to the kind of concerns that are being expressed.
And as mentioned before, that basically means they need to hurry up with their PR stints rather than make any actual institutional changes.
Alan Rusbridger?
Well, look at America. Social media in the hands of a few billionaires, nobody knowing what to believe, a president declaring war on the media and suing the media. If we want that kind of polarized media where nobody knows what to believe, go right ahead. If you don't want that, stick with the BBC.
I mean, that's just an incredible thing to say after people have literally left the BBC because they were caught being massively biased. It's so funny. Man who works at BBC says BBC's perfectly fine and actually every alternative's worse. Nah, sorry, GB News, actually better. And I do mean that. And this is an attitude that you see everywhere on Twitter. Roger Bolton, ex-presenter on BBC Radio 4's Feedback, said, "This is a tragedy for Tim and the BBC and for the PSB as a whole. Independent, impartial journalism is under threat. The BBC must not be cowed by partisan pressure groups and lying politicians. Tim Davie was a fine Director General in the BBC, and the licence fee payers were lucky to have him." When Tim Davie, by the way, joined the BBC at the behest of Boris Johnson and obviously Dominic Cummings, basically every lefty said, "Oh, this is the BBC trying to go very right wing." After 5 years and him doing nothing, it turns out, oh, he was a man that basically joined us with the bias, therefore he needs to stay. It's root and branch with the BBC, and this is why I understand people who just want it to die. Again, I'm a bit more open to it completely having a root and branch reform, but at the end of the day, you know, is that really the same BBC still? Well, it'll have the logo, I suppose, but it will be a lot better to watch. Adam Boulton, who is a Times Radio presenter and had a junior role at the BBC decades ago, frankly, he decided to have a massive defence of the BBC for some reason, saying, "For the record, no words were put into Trump's mouth. The quotes were him saying what he said." Again, this is just completely disingenuous. The problem isn't that a speech was cut down and edited. The problem is that it was done in such a way that actually implied, or not even implied, just blatantly tried to make out Trump said something that he didn't actually say. Context of this whole thing matters, but a lot of journalists are trying to say, well, we edit things all the time, what's the problem? The problem is that when you edit it in such a way that the summary is completely different to what was actually said in the hour-long speech or however long he was talking for. It's indefensible, and you are embarrassing yourself by tweeting things like this. Why do you watch Times Radio, Haryan? Because people like this are there, and it's important to know what they think. Because at the end of the day, they are still in charge of editorial decisions. Anyway, Phil Craig, an ex-BBC journalist, actually went against Bolton here, basically saying that, well, when I was working at the BBC alongside the likes of Fred Emery and a load of other names on Panorama, the idea that you would take a speech and splice together two opposite ends of it 54 minutes apart and make it out like Trump was saying storm the Capitol when he didn't, it would have had them all in meltdown. To which Bolton says, bully for you, this was not a news report. It was 3 years after the event, in hindsight, when Trump's speech contributed to the violence at the Capitol, and after he'd refused to intervene while it was going on. Which, again, that second part isn't actually true. He did send something out on Truth Social to say stop it, or at least act peacefully. But again, this is a big problem we have with journalism in Britain, and not just in the BBC, but an awful lot of other places. Even the Times has a left-wing bias, really. And it's just that they actually believe that the BBC did nothing wrong. They believe splicing together two opposite ends of a speech to literally put words in Trump's mouth was fine, because they edit things all the time, don't you know? As if there's not good and bad editing, as if there's not honest and dishonest editing. I mean, I know this, and I've literally been doing this as an amateur for 8 years. The whole point of my channel is that I don't lie about things and I don't deceptively edit. I don't think I've ever done it in my whole time here. And if I have, someone please point to it, because I'd like to correct any mistakes like that, because I think that it absolutely ruins people's trust in you. And one thing I really wanted from doing this was for people to trust me, so that when I do say things in videos like this, they can take me at my word. It takes ages to build something like that up, and it can be literally demolished within seconds, and the BBC's been demolishing itself for 10 years. Anyway, ex-Trotskyist, apparently ex anyway, and current presenter of BBC Radio 4's Briefing Room, David Aronovich, said, Is that right, Malcolm? After Malcolm said at this rate the only mourners at the BBC's funeral will be a bunch of beraggled drag queens, some second-rate queer artists and a couple of furries. For those of you wondering, this was in response to the BBC picking 12 great music artists of 2025 and something like 4 or 5 of them being trans. Over a third, anyway. I work at a department called Longform Audio. It makes the briefing room more or less the Wreath lectures, dozens of documentaries. Its producers and editors are some of the best and most conscientious journalists I know, and you want them all fired. Which is so funny because, again, it's just, listen, there's massive, massive areas of the BBC that are institutionally biased and are still trying to push the whole pro-trans thing despite the fact that it's been dead for about 2 years now. And yeah, Mr. Uranovich, Mr. ex-Trotskyist, Mr. I managed to get to Eastern Europe in the 80s when there was a massive iron curtain in the way, which you can only do if your parents are spies. There is an issue with left-wing bias there. I mean, how difficult is it for BBC journalists to just come out and say, yeah, this is quite stupid? The answer is incredibly difficult because they literally risk their jobs. Again, a news presenter has been reprimanded for saying woman instead of pregnant people. Yes, that is an unbelievable level of bias, and yes, the only people that care to keep the BBC are journalists that work there and trans radical activists that are addicted to Doctor Who. David Yelland, who used to be editor for The Sun, who used to have a go about BBC bias all the time while he was editor, by the way, said, "What's happened today at the BBC is nothing short of a coup, a national disgrace. The corporation's board has effectively been undermined, and elements close to it have worked with hostile newspaper editors and former PM and enemies of public service broadcast. The only honourable player here are Tim Davies and Deborah Turness." Well, thank you, man who now presents BBC Radio 4 and BBC Sound programme when it hits the fan. Again, a lot of these people, they're just saying this to keep jobs. That's the reason for it. If in 2 weeks the BBC board is completely taken aback and replaced with people who are actually going to deal with the bias, a lot of these people will be saying this is the best thing to happen to the BBC since. I have to wrap my head around it. I have no idea. I guess when Monty Python was taken up by the BBC and it revolutionised sketch shows, but that's nothing to do with BBC News. BBC News was just generally trusted. I guess it just chugged along. I don't know, I butchered that metaphor, so we'll just continue. John Simpson, a BBC World presenter and presenter of BBC Two's Unspun World, said Nick Robinson is exactly right. There is a genuine concern about editorial standards and mistakes, and there is also a political campaign by people who want to destroy the organisation that you are currently listening to. Both things are happening at the same time. Well, yeah, one of those things kind of leads into the other. There is a political campaign to end the BBC. You are correct. I fully support it, because editorial standards have been shocking for a decade. So if I wanted to nip this problem in the bud, I'd probably deal with those problems that you admit are happening, rather than just say, well, the BBC's the gold standard, don't you know, you can't criticise it. That's effectively what these people are saying, despite the fact that they have... there is no politician even bothering to defend it apart from the Lib Dems. Cross-party support from Labour to Tories to Reform have all criticised the Panorama mistake, if they want to call it a mistake. The Panorama hit piece that may well have been very good for 50 minutes, but yeah, the whole thing's ruined by that summary of the speech, I'm afraid. There is no politician coming to their defence because it's an absolutely ridiculous thing to have to come out and try to defend. And also, if Labour are in opposition, they would be defending the BBC, by the way, but they can't because they need to get on Trump's good side to save the economy, pretty much. Funny how incentives like that work out. And then John Simpson had another tweet where it was even more fawning over how great Tim Davie was and how great Deborah Turness was, and that the BBC's enemies could possibly be glad they've resigned. Yeah, okay, fine. BBC has a lot of enemies, but it's amazing. If you're impartial, you probably don't actually make that many enemies. If you are biased, you tend to make quite a lot. Just something to think about. Anyway, Alistair Campbell comes out to say Panorama made mistakes, but this scandal is the work of populists trying to control the airwaves, and they won't rest. As opposed to Elise trying to control what's on the airwaves, which was happening for quite a few years until people got fed up and everyone started moving over to GB News, yes. Alistair Campbell summarised this article with the real weakness of the BBC as exemplified by recent events is its failure to stand up to ludicrous claims from the right that it is somehow hugely biased to the left, apart from, you know, all the evidence we have. Listening to Telegraph journalists bleat about biased BBC or Reform MPs enjoying more platforming than any minority party in history underlines that. Again, that's probably because They're winning a whole load of elections, Alistair, and they are polling higher than any other party. This is the way, and also, I barely see the BBC actually writing about reformed announcements. And they have reform MPs on panels, and obviously Z Youth as well on panels, sure. But I've seen Zach Polanski on the BBC about 4 times on the BBC over the past 2 weeks, so what are you on about? This is the work of right-wing journalists and owners working hand-in-glove with right-wing force inside the BBC to undermine it. I do love this whole idea that Alistair Campbell's effectively said, oh, a load of righties are complaining that the BBC's biased to the left, but actually did you know they're biased to the right? Incredibly ludicrous, given that basically everyone who wants the BBC actually defunded is on the right wing because they hate the left wing bias, and all the claims of right wing bias are by people who are actively defending the BBC, which is exactly here. The Labour government needs to help the BBC stand up for itself and clear out forces who want the BBC to fail. See what I mean? Alistair Campbell, first half of this paragraph. The BBC's got a bit of a right-wing bias, actually. Last paragraph. The BBC needs to be defended, though. Come off it. Like, this is the worst statement I think I've seen in all of this. Even worse than Bolton trying to say that Trump didn't have words put in his mouth. Anyway, yet another ex-BBC presenter who is now working for what just feels like an arm of the BBC, the newsagents, Lewis Goodall. A few reminders of what Trump said leading up to January 6th. There'll be a big protest, we'll never give up or concede. Just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. We're going to fight like hell. Blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. But then on January 6th itself, Trump, over roughly 70 minutes, used the words fights, fighting, or fighters more than 20 times. Again, it's a thing that a lot of people do tend to miss out, but there's a lot of military language used within politics because at the end of the day it is just war by other means. You fight an election, you have a campaign. Leafleters and activists are known as foot soldiers. Boots on the ground, if you will. Yeah, there's military... I mean, are you ever going to see Lewis Goodall say anything like this with the Democrats saying similar things or Mamdani saying similar things? No, of course you're not. But he finishes off with, the BBC Panorama edit was a mistake. Incredible. Incredible. Trying to defend BBC Panorama, just then make the next tweet say, actually it was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened, but it is possible to think that, and think that it did not fundamentally misrepresent Trump's overall actions. No, actually, that was the whole problem. It did misrepresent Trump's overall actions in the lead up to January 6th and on the day itself. With the BBC resiling from it, its presence is an entirely false impression that Trump's false version of the events is true. These journalists can't even get their stories straight. You've got half of them saying that there was no mistake made, you've got others saying there was a mistake, but actually it was a mistake that doesn't really matter because it doesn't actually misrepresent Trump, when actually the problem is that it did misrepresent Trump. Just, these people are in panic mode. Again, why do I enjoy Times Radio? Because it's pretty much this every day. And I find it really entertaining because they have no idea how to deal with a world that they have basically begged for years. And now they're getting an obvious reaction to a world that they've made that's terrible. Half of them are trying to pretend that there's actually no problem whatsoever, and the other half are saying, yeah, I guess there are mistakes, but I'm going to defend them anyway. Anyway, Ava Santino, one of the last surviving Politics Joe original presenters, said the BBC should have held fast on editorial decision re Panorama. Journalists always splice together most important lines of a political speech. Moral panic over general practice. Ridiculous. Again, just embarrassing themselves, these journalists, by trying to pretend that nothing wrong happened in this instance. Anyway, when pushback obviously came on this, Ava said, all packages are spliced together elements, or do you run 56-minute Donald Trump speeches in their entirety on ITV West Country? Again, just sticking your head in the sand of the actual criticism here. Obviously, you edit down speeches. What you don't do is splice together two completely separate parts of the speech, 56 minutes apart, to then try and imply that Trump said, fight the Capitol, rather than march there and protest while the politicians in Congress fight in the Capitol, which is actually what was said. Anyway, the final part of the what did people have to say on Twitter is Nick Robinson, former BBC and ITV political editor and host of the Today programme, so we actually heard him before, and he wrote an essay-long hope and seethe struggle session, really. What has happened and what is happening at the BBC? In normal times, you might be forgiven for dismissing that question as navel-gazing by journalists who can't resist talking about themselves. Well, that's what's happening. In normal times, I'd be inclined to agree with you. These, though, are not normal times. Ever since the first rumours of the resignation surfaced, I've been piecing together what happened which led to this crisis. It's simple. The bias is still there and nothing was done about it. Those at the top of the BBC have appeared paralysed for the past week, unable to agree on what to say, not just about the editing of Trump's speech by Panorama, but also wider claims of institutional bias. The problem they have is that all the critics are right. That is the problem they have. But they can't admit that, because then basically everyone under them at the BBC is probably going to protest saying, no, we're not biased, we're being impartial. Because fundamentally, like the NHS, the BBC is incapable of taking criticism. It just is. One source described the arguments that have raged ever since the Telegraph published the leaked memo by a former advisor to the BBC board like an armed combat. Another alleged political interference after what they described as a hostile takeover of parts of the BBC. The BBC is run by a board made up of leaders of the major divisions of the corporation and part-time directors appointed by the government of the day. This is an interesting part. The BBC News executives, the journalists who run the news division, agreed the wording of the statement at the beginning of last week, admitting it had been a mistake to edit together two different sections of Trump's speech on the day of the Capitol Hill riots, which clearly signalled to the audience that the edit had been made. It would have concluded that despite this error, there was no intention to mislead the audience. This was not enough for the BBC board, which refused to sign off on the statement because it's an obvious lie. That's why they know that's not going to hold water. You cannot make that edit and say, oh, it was just a mistake. Sorry, you put those two parts together on purpose as an editorial decision, let's face it, to make Trump seem worse than he is. The report it had received from Michael Prescott, who was an independent advisor to the BBC's editorial guidelines and standards board until June 2025, stated that the Panorama film created the impression that Trump said something he did not, and in doing so materially misled viewers. The argument, which raged on the BBC board, ensured that the BBC neither defended itself nor admitted its mistake for day after the leak of the Prescott dossier alleged institutional bias. A criticism mounted from the White House, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and many others. The BBC only said that it would not comment on leaked documents, whilst promising that the chairman of the BBC, Samir Shah, would respond in writing to MPs on Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. In a resignation statement last night, Chief Executive of BBC News Deborah Turness stated that the ongoing controversy around Panorama on President Trump has reached a stage where it caused damage to the BBC, an institution that I love. Neither she nor outgoing Director General Tim Davie explained what they thought had gone wrong. Because ultimately, again, they know that the critics are right, and admitting that is going to absolutely irritate everyone in BBC departments. Quite clearly we're seeing that from literally everyone defending the BBC to the bone on Twitter who works for the BBC. Imagine that times 1,000, that's just on Twitter. Thousands work for the BBC, and an awful lot of them agree with their editorial standards, which are lax at best. The majority of the BBC board appear to agree with the editorial advisor that there is a problem of institutional bias reflected in the coverage of Trump, Gaza, Israel and trans rights. Wow, no duh. The board think there's institutional bias and have done nothing about it. This is why they're struggling with a statement, because they're trying to come up with a reason. And the best reason they probably have is honestly laziness. That argument has been led by one board member, Sir Robbie Gibb, a former BBC executive in charge of political programmes, who became Prime Minister Theresa May's Downing Street Director of Comms, and one of those involved in the founding of GB News. Friends of Sir Robbie insist he has repeatedly and consistently supported Tim Davie and wants him to stay, and has written articles supporting the BBC and the licence fee. It's quite a funny CV, really, that. And again, I wouldn't exactly call Theresa May a staunch right-winger. In fact, she's one of the reasons that I would argue the party's gone very left-wing. As of last night, the BBC's board, 15 members, have still not agreed on the wording of the statement that is due to be made today by the chairman of the BBC, Samir Shah. We're expecting that letter to be published later in the morning. A final thought, I understand that at the time of transmission of the Panorama film in October 2024, there were no complaints received about the editing of Donald Trump's speech. Largely, I imagine, because the only people who watched it already thought that Donald Trump was a violent maniac. And honestly, yeah, it's also why it's probably worth a lot of people on the alternate media basically fact-checking all this. That was a really obvious cut in the speech, and if anyone on the alternative media actually looked into it, it would have been quite obvious that there was a ridiculous editorial standard mistake being made there. But nobody online has a licence fee, so we couldn't watch it, which I suppose is the best defence that the BBC have against the alternative media. People don't pay for their licence fees on this side of the fence. Anyway, I think with that I have more than covered the absolutely ridiculous lengths journalists will go to defend an absolutely ridiculous decision by the BBC. As a journalist, you can't complain about the BBC unless you expect to stay in right-wing circles, because ultimately left-wing circles have BBC at the centre of it all. So can't criticise it, that's like criticising God. Much like you can't criticise the NHS, it's ridiculous and needs a change. Anyway, with that, that is where I will leave it for today. So, thank you all very much for watching. Please do subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, do become a channel member, leave a super chat or super thanks as well. In terms of streaming, Tuesday, tomorrow, we are going through our ideal budget and cabinet. Obviously, it's going to be very reform focused because they're expected to win. So catch that over on the Worcester Club gaming stream on Wednesday, and then Friday there'll be Wolves of Westminster. And there is a pushback on Laughing at the Guardian. It's next Saturday, not this Saturday, as I'm away this Saturday. And with that, I think that's everything I had for you for today. So once again, thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.